Hi guys, it's ASBYT and welcome to the second part of the Ultimate Smartphone Buyer's Guide 2020.
Now, if a good camera is your main priority in a new smartphone, then here is what you need to know, starting first from a video point of view. Most phones now come with the ability to shoot in 4K at a variety of different frame rates. This is being shot in 4K at 30 frames a second on both the iPhone 11 Pro and the Pixel 4 XL. These are the two examples I'm using. And as I said, 4K tends to be the max you can shoot in, other than the Samsung Galaxy S20 Ultra, which now can shoot in a whopping 8K. Only available on the rear camera, and there are a few limitations to it as well, but you are future-proofing, and it's still incredible that this can be done on a smartphone. And even though there are not a great deal of 8K TVs, for example, currently right now, the footage difference is still noticeable on lower res screens, and you can crop in and get some great stills from that video as well. Follow me over on Instagram, where I am teaming up with Samsung to show you how to actually do that.
Now, frame rate is not actually as complicated as it may sound to some of you, but let's address it because you may be buying a phone with features that you don't really need. Very simply, the number of FPS, or frames per second, represents the amount of times the image refreshes per second. So theoretically, if it was 5 FPS, the footage would be very jarring with a lot of motion blur because the image is only refreshing 5 times per second. Whereas 120 FPS, for example, would be very smooth because you're getting 120 images together in 1 second. 24 frames per second is considered cinema standard and has a specific cinematic, dreamy, mild, motion blurry kind of look, which we as a society have become accustomed to. 30 frames per second is more well known for standard TV or educational videos, and like a lot of content that you will see on YouTube. It's what I'm currently shooting this on, although I'm exporting in 60 frames per second to show better refresh rates on phones, etc. And 60 frames per second is great for sports, gameplay, anything that's fast motion that you don't really want any motion blur on. If there isn't much movement within the frame and you're using 60 frames per second, the picture often looks a little bit odd, and I personally wouldn't advise shooting 60 frames per second if you're not doing a lot of movement. Apart from one scenario, creating slow-mo footage in post. If you shoot in a high frame rate, either 60 or 120 FPS, you can slow that footage down in your edit, and because there's more information, there are more frames, the footage remains nice and smooth. If you slow down 24 frames per second, even 30 frames per second, it can often look a little bit jarry, jerky, and just not very smooth. Now, yes, most smartphones do offer built-in slow-mo features, and I think Huawei lead the race with the highest amount of frame rate. I think it's 7,860 FPS. Let me just check. I was bang on at 720p. Another hugely important feature to look out for video is stabilization. Most phones now have some form of stabilization for video on both rear and front cameras, whether that be OIS, optical image stabilization, or EIS, electronic image stabilization, or both. OIS is generally considered better as you actually have pieces of the lens that shift to compensate for shaky hand movements, whereas EIS is done via software only. The iPhone 11 series has brilliant stabilization, but so do quite a few other Android phones now, including the Oneplus 8 Pro and the Galaxy S20 series, as you may have seen in my full comparison video of the three phones. HDR, or high dynamic range, is another phrase that gets bandied about across many different review videos. Very simply, it technically means the camera takes more than one photo at the same time in differing exposures and blends them together for one image. The better HDR capabilities, the more detail there will be in the darkest points of the shot, whilst avoiding blowing out or overexposing the brightest areas like skies. A lot of smartphone cameras now have the primary lens and ultra wide angle lens, and the growing trend over the last few years has been huge zoom distance capabilities, often using some sort of periscope lens. The Find X2 Pro, the P40 Pro and the S20 Ultra again come to mind, but if you're asking me the question, are these huge zooms necessary? I'd have to say yes and no. The key is to look for a high optical zoom number, as if a zoom is optical, it means that up to that specific number, whether that be 2 times, 3 times, 5 times, the image quality will be relatively unchanged. If the zoom is digital, the image quality will very quickly degrade as you zoom in. So if your phone has, for example, 5 times optical zoom, it means that you can zoom in up to 5 times and the image quality will be pretty much the same, just closer. If it's 2 times optical zoom, like the iPhone 11 Pro, you'll get that same image quality up to 2 times, and then if you go to 3, 4 and 5 times zoom, it will start to get quite grainy. Now, the Galaxy S20 Ultra offers 10 times hybrid zoom, a mix of optical and digital, and up to 100 times digital zoom. The Oppo Find X2 Pro and Huawei P40 Pro offer 60 times and 50 times digital zoom, respectively, but I personally don't think you should buy a phone like this if the selling point for you is just the huge zoom capabilities, because the actual image quality is average at best. That being said, they are all fun to play around with in those distances, and the true brilliance of those big zoom smartphones is in the sort of 5 to 10 to 20, sometimes even 30 times you can get some really great shots with those. Now, before we dissect battery life, a quick word from today's video sponsor, ESR. They've been kind enough to send over 4 of their brand new 2020 iPhone SE cases. Even though the new iPhone is the most affordable of the selection, you still probably don't want to break it on day one. We've got the tempered glass case, the metal kickstand case, and this slim clear soft. So a great variety for every need. My favourites are probably the tempered glass, which I've got here in 2 different colours, and the kickstand ones. The first is made of 9H tempered glass, which maintains the premium look and feel of the iPhone that perhaps softer cases don't. It's scratch resistant and has soft corners which are better for shock absorption. Whereas the kickstand case has, and clues in the name, a stand and gives you a great option to hold your phone up either in portrait or landscape, great for media consumption or taking photos of course. The info for all 4 of these cases and everything else that ESR do, including screen protectors, wireless chargers, earphones and a range of other accessories for your iPhone, iPad or Android device, will be left in the video description below, so definitely go and check that out if you're interested. So jumping back to battery life, sometimes it's not quite as cut and dried as how big is the battery cell in mAh or milliamp hours. The phone in question's software and chipsets all have a big influence on battery drain. The iPhone 11 Pro Max, for example, has a battery cell size of 3,969 mAh compared to my Samsung S20 Ultra, which has a 5,000 mAh battery cell, yet the 11 Pro Max has absolutely killed the game when it comes to battery life since its release last year, largely due to the iOS software and of course the A13 Bionic chip. I strongly recommend you check out my iPhone 11 Pro versus Galaxy S20 Ultra versus OnePlus 8 Pro video for a new take on a battery drain test between those 3 phones and just an overall comparison on which phone I think is actually best. Now, if you want to use your phone for media consumption and gaming, then of course a great display is a necessity. But there are of course a lot of factors which make a great display. For simplicity, I've narrowed it down to 3 core features. Firstly, you need to decide whether you're going for an LCD or AMOLED/OLED, which are essentially the same. The main advantage of LCD technology is it's usually cheaper, but most flagships are now using AMOLED panels as they generally have a fair few advantages. Firstly, every pixel can be switched off separately from one another, so as a result, there's no need for a backlight like there is with an LCD screen. So blacks are richer, darker, and images on the whole tend to have a greater contrast because there is no backlight shining through. Also, because these pixels can be turned off, it generally helps save your battery. Some people complain of burn-in or colour shifts over time to the more consistent LCD technology, but other people don't really have a problem. For me personally, if you can afford it, I would always recommend going with an AMOLED display, but it's not so cut and dried. The second key display factor is refresh rate. Similar to frame rate, as we've already mentioned, the higher the number, the more times the display refreshes per second. This provides a smoother, more fluid experience. I think the highest currently on a smartphone is 144 Hz. The Red Magic comes to mind. But OnePlus, Samsung, Huawei, Oppo, Xiaomi, all of these companies pretty much have upped their refresh rate from the standard 60 Hz, which we've seen for many years up until a couple of years ago when things started to shift. The only major company that haven't is Apple. iPhone 12 is going to have 120 Hz. Now, while great, these refresh rates obviously have nothing to do with actual image quality and sharpness. That comes down to the actual resolution the phones can output. Manufacturers have been upping this as well as PPI or pixels per inch over the last few years as well. And generally, we now have 4 different options: 720p HD, 1080p Full HD, 1440p or Quad HD, and 2160 or 4K. Still to this day, there are very few 4K display smartphones. I think Sony comes to mind as a company who have been producing 4K displays for quite a few years now, but the majority of others have been Full HD or Full HD Plus, now with the longer, narrower display aspect ratio, or Quad HD Plus as well. So do you really need a 4K or or Quad HD display on a smartphone? Well, I personally have been a bit spoiled over the last couple of years being able to test and use both 4K and Quad HD displays, and I can notice the difference, but I think it's quite slight, and I think the average consumer doesn't necessarily really need a 4K display, and to some extent even a Quad HD one. Full HD or Full HD Plus phones still look excellent if the panel is good. 1080p is still good enough for pretty much all you need to do on a smartphone because the screen is so small, different to a 55-inch or 65-inch TV where the difference is more noticeable. And in fact, Samsung actually limit their S20 range to 1080p if you're using the 120Hz higher refresh rate. The only one I would steer clear from now that we're in 2020 is 720. You can still use a 720p phone and you can get on with it quite fine. I just think, especially if you're trying to future-proof, it's long gone. Personally, with all the phones that I've had available to me, I would have to say the Galaxy S20 range and the OnePlus 8 Pro, which uses a Samsung panel of course as well, are probably the best two displays on the market. If I had to pick one, I would probably actually go with the OnePlus 8 Pro, simply because you can have the resolution at Quad HD and the high refresh rate of 120Hz as well at the same time. On top of that, it's super bright at 1300 nits, and with its MEMC smoothing technology along with the JNCD rating of 0.4, it really is a display dream. Now, are you still a little bit confused about which phone might be best for you? Good, because I'm just about to make it even more complicated. Over the last few years, it has of course become harder to decide on a brand new handset due to three new factors. The oldest of those three factors, and probably the most simple to get your head around, is do you want a curved display or a flat display? The curved display was most notably seen on Samsung devices first, but that trend has spread throughout the market, and some manufacturers have even evolved it slightly into what they call a waterfall display, which is even more sharp on the sides with even smaller bezels. I personally am a big fan of how it makes the phone look. It's very immersive, but granted, there's not a huge amount of extra functionality with that style of display. There's also increased fragility because of it, and some people complain of accidental touches, etc., which you don't get, or it's very minimal, on a flat display. Now, curved displays, as mentioned, have been very popular in the last couple of years amongst manufacturers and consumers, but I wouldn't be surprised, and I've got a sneaky suspicion that the flat display may be just about to make a comeback. Now, the second new choice we now have is, do you go with a standard smartphone or do you go with a foldable or flexible phone? The likes of the Galaxy Fold, Galaxy Flip, or Mate XS, for example. Now, while I have absolutely loved using the Galaxy Fold, I can still see its drawbacks, and personally, unless you have the money for two devices, I certainly think waiting and not being an early adopter may serve you well, as improvements to durability and form and function, I'm sure, are just around the corner. Now, the third new decision that's cropped up recently is, do you buy a gaming smartphone? And what is a gaming smartphone? Now, the main benefits are that they usually come with liquid cooling systems to reduce thermal throttling and thus maintaining optimum performance. They often have front-facing stereo speakers, headphone jacks as well still, as well as the much talked about high refresh rates and gaming modes as well, which limit notifications, etc. when you are mid-game. And one of the great things that I love about them, and that does tend to set them apart slightly from normal smartphones, is the design of them, how they look, how they feel in the hand, and the accessories that can be bundled in as well, including joysticks and triggers, etc. Now, again, similar to foldable smartphones, I do see a place for these on the market, but I think for the vast majority of people, just right now, they're not quite necessary. And that's simply because most high-end phones have a lot of those features anyway. Another case in point, OnePlus, for example, with their Fanatic mode, made in conjunction with the esports organizer. So yes, I like gaming phones, and if you are a heavy gamer or an esports player, for example, in one of those different games, then definitely something to consider. But again, for the average consumer, possibly not necessary. Now, one very key important thing to think about is when you've decided on your specific phone that you like the look of, make sure it's compatible with your network provider. The likes of O2 and EE in the UK, Verizon and AT&T in the US, and Airtel in India, for example. Check which bands the phone supports and check which bands your network uses. If these correlate, you should be fine and have access to 4G and 5G if you're quite there yet. And speaking of 5G, is that 100% necessary for you right now? Another thing to consider. Very small portions of towns and cities in the UK currently have the infrastructure for 5G. The same in the US and globally as well. Some places don't have any areas with 5G at all, but don't get it twisted, 5G is coming and they really are ramping up production in a lot of areas. So if you want to future-proof yourself, then definitely consider getting a phone that's compatible with 5G as well. For more information on 5G, I will leave a link in the video description below for a video that I did on that. It's a little bit old, the quality is not amazing, but still it gives you all the information you need to know about 5G and what's about to happen. A lot to take in, but pretty much all the phones I've talked about in this video, I have done separate review videos on, so make sure you go and check those out if you're interested in a specific phone. If there's anything I've missed in this huge two-parter video, then please let me know in the comment section below and I'll try my best to answer you or help you out with your queries. Like and share the video if you enjoyed it and think others might find it helpful as well. Subscribe if you're new to the channel and love everything tech, breaking tech news, unboxings, reviews. I love you and leave you. I'll see you in the next one. ASBYT, peace out.
Do just what you want.